Today we're working on our Welt Pockets. So this is extra credit for our project, but it's a fairly easy pocket. And it can be put into any kind of flat area. However, it has quite a few steps to it, and it does involve some precision. So, as I said, this is extra credit. As far as the requirements for the vest, you'll just need to apply the welt as is instructed in the pattern envelope. But if you want 25 points extra credit, then you would need to execute the real pockets, and these are welt pockets, okay? So what you're going to need, and this is what the finished pocket is going to look like. All right, so the welt is going to be on there in one way or another. So if you're following the pattern instructions, you're just going to see this welt here. If you're making the actual pocket, behind that welt will be a pocket. Okay, so we'll look in there. We've got our little contrast lining. It's a very shallow pocket because it's very close to the edge. And then traditionally, men would have had pocket watches and things like that in there. It's a place where you can just keep just something little. If you have a little key or card key or something. But yeah, so that's our welt pocket in our vest is what that's going to look like. So what you're going to need is your front piece. Hopefully you've thread traced the top and bottom. So it's a weird little shape that's there. We've got 3 lines joined by a little V at the end, and you will have thread traced the top line and the bottom line. The top line is slightly shorter than the bottom line, and you want to thread trace these to the outside of the garment. Okay, the first thing we need to do is you'll have the front piece, you'll have your welt, and you'll have your pocket lining. Okay, first thing we need to do is make our welt. So we'll fold this long ways, and if you note on our pattern, this has a 3/8 inch seam, not a 5/8 inch seam. Okay, and I've just drawn that on there so that I'll know. This side kind of makes the most sense. It's just a straight line. This one is drawn a little oddly. And I just drew that little dog leg there to kind of catch because that was the shape. That was easier to make the shape. But actually this is going to be stitched straight down. So it's really 3/8, but it comes and it stops at the point there. Okay. I really am not sure why it's cut that way, but it is, and that's how we end up sewing it. Okay. So we're going to stitch on our stitching line, which is 3/8 of an inch. And it's construction stitching, so we are back stitching front and back. We're just stitching both short ends. All right, and now what we want to do is when we go, we're going to turn this right side out, but these corners here are going to have a fair amount of bulk in them when we go to turn them. So what we're going to do is we're just going to clip a little triangle off right at that corner, okay? We don't want to come in past the stitching line. So we'll do that at both top corners. The bottom doesn't matter because it's not turning a whole corner, that's flat. So we just need to do it at the top where the fold is. And we turn this right side out. And then you're going to want to make these corners come out and be nice and sharp and pretty. You can use a number of things for this. I like to use a knitting needle, and you could use a pen. A pen or pencil is hard. It's a good shape, but you might get ink coming out. Scissors are challenging because you don't want to poke through. Same thing with a seam ripper. So the reason I like the sewing needle is because it does come to a point, but that point is rounded. Knitting needle, rather. Another way you can do it is you can actually take a pin and kind of pull that corner out. You just want to be careful because since we've cut it, there's kind of some threads up there, and you don't want to poke your tool straight through that corner, nor do you want just those little threads from where you clipped it to come through. So you want that corner to be as sharp as possible. Okay, so that's what we want that to look like. And it's got kind of a diagonal edge to it. Now we're going to come over and we're going to press these. So we're just pressing that little edge, pressing those side seams down, and pressing across the fold on the top. All right, so now this is our welt, okay? So we start with the welt, and you want, when we're going to learn how to place this, so it might be a little challenging to see with the pattern, but when we place this on the vest front, we want we're just going to lay it on that first line that we thread traced, just to kind of get our placement. And if you look, when it's laying like this, then the side seam and the edge of the welt are essentially parallel. If I flipped this way, see how now it's at this sharp angle? What we want is for those to be kind of parallel. That's why this is cut on that angle, so that when we lay it on the angle of the vest, we've got a parallel to the side seam. So that's how we know where to place that. Now that we've placed it, it needs to be stitched this way. And what we need is we need to stitch 5/8 onto this line. Okay, so what we might need to do then is take a ruler and a marking utensil and mark a 5/8 line. Okay, I used white because it's a dark fabric and I wanted to be able to have that contrast for you. You also could do a thread trace. You could just baste a 5/8 inch line. That might be an easy way to do it as well. And now, similar to what we did with the darts, we need to line this 5/8 inch line up with that stitching line. So it should come right to the end. We should be going straight through that line. We're going to come back through that stitching line and up through our 5/8 here. Okay, so that's what we're going to do to get this welt placed. I like to do the ends on the welt, coming through the stitching line, coming back through the stitching line into our drawn line. So again, it's a similar process to the dart. It's just a little trickier because it's kind of in the middle. And you've got two separate pieces. All right, so we've got that pinned. We've got the raw edge up. We've matched the ends of the welt with the ends of that stitching line. And now we're going to stitch this in place. And you want to be very, again, this pocket requires precision. You want to start exactly on the end of that welt. You don't want to go past it. So you want to be extra careful when you backstitch that you don't go too far. And then when we get down here, same thing, we want to end right exactly. You don't want to be too far inside and you don't want to be past it. Alright, so now we've stitched our welt onto the vest front. Now we'll trim it. So we'll clip our threads because we're going to be stitching several times and it's going to be very easy for us to have a whole lot of threads kind of hanging out. And that'll get frustrating to deal with, okay? So the next step is this 5/8. We need to trim down to 1/8. And you want to be careful not to cut the vest behind the actual vest. We're just cutting this seam allowance down. Cutting it down to about 1/8 would be ideal. 1/4 inch to 1/8. Okay. All right, so now we have our welt on. The next step is actually to stitch our lining on top of that, okay? So we're going to stitch this on top, we're going to cut our hole, and then we're going to turn the whole thing to the inside. It'll be one of our little magic moments. So on our lining, we've got a fold line that's drawn all the way across, and then we've got our little 3 lines with the triangle ends. So the longer bottom line is going to line up with what we just sewed. So once again, we want to line that up similar to how we did the dart. I'm going to go through this drawn line all the way through, and we want to be right on that stitching line. Come back through on that line. Okay, so exact same process, we're going through 3 layers. And I've noticed that the line that I've drawn here is a little bit longer than the welt. Well, you want to stop that at the welt. You don't want to stitch past it. So, and you can see and feel where the end of that is from the thickness of it. Okay, so now I've got it pinned through that stitching line, through this drawn line. And now I'm going to do the exact same thing. We're just stitching on that line. From the end of the welt to the other end of the welt. And if it helps you to put a perpendicular pin there, you're welcome to do that. Okay. All right, so now we've got that stitched the exact same way as the welt was. And now all of our little marks are about to start making some sense. I'm going to start on the top side on the lining because the drawn lines are a little clearer. Oh, actually, I'm about to skip a step. All right, so we've stitched on the bottom line. Now we need to stitch the top line. And that doesn't, and it technically lines up with this other stitching line here. It's just got to be It's as long as it's on there straight and flat. The line you really have to match up is what's happening on the bottom. And this is a shorter line. You want to make sure that you start and stop where it's marked, because this is where the opening is going to be, and it's going to be hidden behind the welt. And if you make it the same length or too long, then the opening will not be hidden anymore. One of the challenges in doing this is you're going to have extra fabric from the vest. You just want to keep that kind of out of the way so that the part that's going under the needle is flat. I'm also kind of checking my dart there to make sure it's laying flat. Okay, so when we're done stitching, we should have two parallel lines, one of which is slightly shorter than the other, the top one, which is slightly shorter. So now what we're going to do, we're going to cut through both layers separately. So I'm going to cut along this center line. I'm going to come down close to the end, and then I'm going to cut a little V shape that ends at the corner of my stitching line. Okay? We're going to do this 4 times. We're going to do it once on either end and once in each layer. Now when I'm cutting down here, you see I've got my seam allowance from the welt. I'm going to try to avoid cutting through that and only cut the lining. We're doing the exact same thing on the inside of the fabric. If you want to make sure you have lines that you can see a little bit better, you can redraw that line. And you're going to stop that cutting across line short enough to be able to make that angle toward the shorter line up top. And again, the more precise, the closer you can get without stitching through those stitching lines, without cutting through the stitching lines, the closer you can get to that corner, the better our pocket's going to look. Okay? So now this is what we should have. We should have this weird little like long line with the 2 V's cut all the way through. Okay? Now, here's our magic moment. Now we're just going to tuck all of this inside. And this folds up. Now we have our welt in place, and it's hiding our little opening for our pocket. Okay, so we just got a couple more steps. So right now I put my hand through, it's going all the way through, right? We need to close off the end of that pocket. So first I'm going to go over to the iron. Actually, let me pull this over here. So we want our welt on this side to be going upward. And we want to pull the vest down so that we don't have a big fold right there at that seam. We just want that to be fairly flat. And then for back here, I'm going to want to roll the edges out. Basically want to press this flat. Alright, so that's going to help press our welt, train it to kind of go up, pressing our little side corners there. And then we're going to press the top of this. Okay, so we've pressed that flat. That gives us a nice flat welt on the front. And now what we need to do is we need to fold this so that our edges match. So that's going to fold just above the opening of your seam. And we want to, and then we'll pin this together. You just want the pocket lining itself to be sewn to the pocket lining. We're not stitching this down to the whole belt. We're just the whole vest. We're just pinning it to itself. Now this is another part that's slightly tricky, but not really bad. So now we've got to get under this. So now we've got to stitch these two layers together independently of the vest, okay? So you just kind of tuck the vest out of the way so you can access that stitching area. And we're going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. And it's a little tricky to go around the corner, so if you wanted to draw 5/8 there so you could know that you were getting 5/8 going around the corner, you're more than welcome to do that. It might make things a little easier. This is the trickiest area up here because we don't want to stitch onto the vest. I want to make sure we're just stitching on the lining. Alright. So this is what our pocket lining should look like on the inside after it's been stitched. And now to help keep this from catching in the seam down there, and if you wanted, you could do a zigzag stitch. If you anticipate you might be using these pockets a lot, you might just run a second row of stitching, or like I said, you could serge around them, but they're all going to be contained inside, so we're not worried about the raveling as much, unless you're worried about it raveling for getting to the point where if you're using it a lot, you might be putting wear and tear on that seam and stressing it out and pulling the stitching. So if you're going to anticipate using the pockets a fair amount, I recommend running a second row of stitching. Okay, so ta-da, there we go. Look, we have our welt pocket. This is the welt, this is the pocket. Now one thing that we do want to do is, right now this is kind of flopping around, okay? So what we want is to stitch these edges. We can do a little top stitch, or you could go and do a hand slip stitch so you don't see the stitching at all. I'm going to do a top stitch because that's probably what most of us are going to do. And again, in a perfect world, you would be using matching thread. I'm using white thread, which has a little bit of a contrast, mostly so you guys can see what's happening. But when you're doing this, you want to make sure that there's not any puckers at the corners, that this welt is laying nice and flat, that your pocket lining is also lying flat. You're going to catch some of the pocket lining in this, but it's not going to interfere or impede the pocket in any way. So we're going to pin through all the layers right at that very, very edge. We're going to do that on both sides. Okay, so once we have that pinned, now we're going to stitch as close to that edge as we can get without going off of the edge. Want everything to be nice and flat right there, but you don't want it to be pulling. And you want to stop right at that seam where the welt pocket starts. All right, see, so we want to be right there on the edge of that seam. Not welt, rather, not the seam. Now, if we wanted a flap pocket, we'd do the exact same thing, but our welt, we would have stitched on the top and it would have become a flap. And then we wouldn't be stitching the sides down like this. All right, so there's our edges top stitched down. And see, we've caught some of the pocket here, but it's not impeding the pocket area where we're going to be using it. And it's helping contain and control that so it's not kind of flopping around in there. All right, so that's what the inside looks like. That's what the outside looks like as a little pocket action. This was just a marking line for us. And since it's a contrast thread, I would pull this out. It's just basted. We don't need it anymore. I'm not going to take points off if you don't do that, but it's just a nice finishing. Just looks better when you don't see that stitching there. All right, so that is the welt pocket. Again, this is extra credit. The welt itself, if you are stitching the welt according to the pattern instructions, it's basically going to stitch on the way that we stitched this initially, and then you skip all the pocket steps and you'll just fold it up and stitch down the sides. So that's going to be how the false welt will work. So that's Welt Pockets, and thank you very much. We will work on the vest back and putting the body together in our next video. Thank you.